like, you know, we dropped the ball on the RA thing, and
all right, maybe, can you guys hear me? Okay, I think we're good then. Let me start my presentation. All right, thank you, Kelsey, and thank you to everybody for tuning in today. As Jeffrey mentioned, or excuse me, as Kelsey mentioned, I am Jeffrey Alvey. I'm an archaeologist at the State Historic Preservation Office. I've been here for about 2 years now, and prior to that, I was an archaeologist at Mississippi State University, where I was involved in archaeological research, a good deal of public archaeology programs, and so I have worked a good deal in this area of combining archaeology with local historic preservation programs, and so I'm happy to be able to talk to you guys about this today. You know, there are a lot of popular misconceptions about what archaeology is, so I feel like whenever I give these kind of talks, it's always a good idea to sort of start with trying to answer this question and help people understand what is archaeology. In my experience, a good way to understand what something is to understand what it is not. And so let's start by talking about what archaeology is not. And this is where a lot of the popular misconceptions about archaeology derive from. It's from our popular media. So you're probably all familiar with Indiana Jones and with the Tomb Raider movies. And so I include these here to make a couple of points. Number one, archaeologists are not treasure hunters, although I suspect most of you realize that. But what we're also not, and what is often portrayed in the popular media, is that archaeologists are essentially antiquarians, that we go and dig these old things up because they're old and because...
Jeffrey?
Yes.
Are you sharing your PowerPoint?
I am.
I'm not seeing it.
Can't see it?
I apologize.
No
Does
problem.
anyone else see his PowerPoint?
Try again. How about now?
Yes, I see it
Okay.
now.
Well, that's great. We'd only gone to one slide, so that's fine. All right, so as I was saying, you know, popular media often portrays archaeology as either treasure hunting or some form of antiquarianism, meaning that we're only interested in these things that we dig up because they're old. But actually what we're interested in is what these things, these artifacts, can tell us about the past. And so I just wanted to communicate that even though archaeology began from this sort of antiquarian point of view, and it began from this, seems to be innate fascination that humans have with old things. You know, we all fill our homes with antiques, and that's undoubtedly sort of how archaeology, the field of archaeology, began. It derived out of this sort of fascination with old things, but I like to think we've moved well beyond that now. Another thing archaeologists don't do is dig dinosaurs. Archaeologists are interested in understanding the human past, and of course dinosaurs predate humans by about 65 million years. And then the last image here is just also to communicate that don't always believe what you see on the History Channel. Archaeologists are not interested in explaining the past using, invoking aliens as having been responsible for building the pyramids or anything else. There's plenty of quite reasonable and simple explanations for how all of these things came to be, like the pyramids. We certainly don't need to invoke aliens. So these are some of the things that archaeology is not. So let's tackle the question of what archaeology is. This is a pretty general definition of what archaeology is. I'm basically paraphrasing from the website of the Society for American Archaeology, which is that archaeology is a study of the human past through material remains in pursuit of a broad and comprehensive understanding of human culture. To get a little more specific in terms of a definition, you could also say that archaeology is a scientific discipline interested in documenting and explaining cultural differences and cultural change. I thought this would be an especially appropriate comment to include here. It feels like we're very much in a transition in our culture where, or at least in our work culture, where we're sort of moving from this era of everybody goes into an office building and so you leave your home, you go to this other place, you do your work there. Here at DNR, we're trying to implement distributed teams policies where people will be allowed to work from home. And of course, during the pandemic, many of us worked from home. And so this, I felt, was a pretty good example of really what archaeologists do, in that this cultural change is going to happen within our work culture, and there's going to be changes in the material culture associated with our work, whether it's our cubicles, our office buildings, all the things we use here when we're at our offices. All of that's going to change as a result of this cultural change of working from home. And so that's really what archaeologists do. We try to understand and explain cultural change by looking at the material remains from the past. Another important point about archaeology that's often another popular misconception is that archaeologists are only interested in the ancient past. This is just simply not true. You may have heard of historical archaeology. Archaeologists now contribute to understanding the more recent history of the human past. And probably most famously, there's a project at the University of Arizona called the Garbology Project, where the archaeologists there are basically studying modern trash from people's homes, from modern landfills, to try and understand the very recent past. And so while archaeologists are always interested in studying the past, it's not necessarily the ancient past. And archaeology has a lot to contribute to our understanding of the historic period as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of the types of archaeology to better understand what archaeology is. So archaeology can be defined by a geographic region, for example, North American archaeology, or it can be defined by the culture that's under study, such as Mayan archaeology. It can be defined by a period of time. I talked about historical archaeology, so we could talk about archaeology as being, or as an archaeologist, as being a prehistoric archaeologist, or another as being a historic archaeologist. And then lastly, we can talk about archaeology, the types of archaeology, by the study of certain materials, or what kind of materials does any particular archaeologist study. So for example, bioarchaeology. This is basically the study of human remains that have been recovered from archaeological contexts. This often revolves around questions related to diet and disease, how demography has changed in the past. As the cover of the book here suggests, this is a very popular topic, this sort of the human transition to agriculture. This is something that bioarchaeologists have spent a lot of time studying, trying to understand how that change in subsistence, going from something like hunting and gathering to agriculture, how that has affected us biologically. And similar to bioarchaeology, there's zooarchaeology, which is basically the study of animal remains from archaeological contexts. Humans, of course, we have a very long relationship with animals. We eat them. We have them as pets. We've had them as pets for a very long time. We substitute their labor. We substitute our labor for theirs. We use them in ways that provides us with labor, such as the use of horses or mules or oxen. So we have this long and very important relationship with animals, and so not surprisingly, animal remains often appear in the archaeological record, and so archaeologists, through the study of these remains, to help us to understand how these relationships with animals, this relationship between animals and humans, has evolved over time. Similarly, we are also interested in the study of plant remains, which is what paleoethnobotanists do. And just like with animals, humans have had this very long relationship with plants. We eat them. We generally don't think of plants as being our pets, but I suspect a pretty good argument could be made for that's exactly what they are. Our house plants are basically things we have in our home to entertain us. We feed them, we water them, we take care of them and ensure their survival, much like we do with our animal pets. So we also have had this long relationship with plants, and again, these remains often show up in the archaeological record, especially in terms of food remains. And so paleoethnobotanists, the work they do can be very important in helping us understand how human diet has changed through time and how we've exploited different kinds of plant resources through time. And that can tell us a lot about how societies organized themselves, basically how they subsisted. Another is called archaeometry, and so this is basically the use of analytical methods from chemistry and physics to study materials from archaeological contexts. Missouri is actually one of the leading places on the planet, really, for this kind of research at the University of Missouri, which is where these photographs are from. There's a laboratory there, an archaeometric laboratory, really doing some of the best research in the world. And so Missouri is one of the areas where Missouri is really a leader in terms of archaeological research. And so generally, these kinds of analyses are geared towards helping us understand where artifacts that we find in the archaeological record came from. So it helps us answer questions related to trade and exchange by looking at the chemical signature of these objects. Underwater archaeology, as the name implies, studies the remains of human activities that lie beneath the surface of water or on coasts. So you might think of something like a shipwreck. These are great time capsules. By analyzing the materials that are found in ancient shipwrecks, you can learn a lot about the societies responsible for that ship and responsible for those materials. But it's not just shipwrecks. You know, humans, we've been on this planet for a long time, so long that many of the places where we have once lived are now underwater. And the only way to really access these materials and study these materials is through underwater archaeology. Of course, during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age, the oceans were much lower because so much of the water was captured in the ice that many of the coastlines that we have today were actually much further out. And so you have ancient settlements along coastlines that are now buried. And again, the only way to access these materials for archaeologists is to undertake these methods of underwater archaeology. And then lastly, in terms of the types of archaeology that I want to highlight, it's a field that we call cultural resource management. This is the field that I work in. Michael Meyer, who'll talk to you guys later. Michael also works in the field of cultural resource management, and the vast majority of archaeologists in this country work within this field. And so this work is basically related to satisfying the requirements of federal and state laws related to historic preservation. And the big law that sort of the umbrella law over a lot of this work is what's called the National Historic Preservation Act, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with, since this is also what CLG is derived from. So this is a lot of archaeology that gets done in this country gets done within the field of cultural resource management. So let's go over just a little bit of terminology to help you better understand archaeology and what archaeologists mean when they use these terms. So when we talk about an archaeological site, we're basically talking about any place where there are physical remains of past human activities. So this can be as small as a pile of stones left behind by a prehistoric hunter, or it can be as large and complex as a place like Cahokia near St. Louis, which many of you are probably aware of. If you've never been able to visit the site, I would encourage you to. There's a great museum there, and it's really one of the most interesting sites in this region. So just a few sort of common categories of these physical remains that archaeologists are so interested in. So you probably heard artifacts. This is a very commonly used idea within archaeology. So an artifact is basically any object that's been made or modified by humans. We also have ecofacts, and so these are basically the natural remains that we find in the archaeological record that are related to human activity. So things like seeds, humans obviously don't make seeds, and so, but they are often found in archaeological contexts and are useful within archaeological research to help us understand the past. And so we tend to refer to these kinds of objects as ecofacts rather than artifacts. And then lastly, there are archaeological features. And so feature is basically a non-portable artifact, such as a storage pit, a fire hearth, the remains of structures or buildings at some site. So these are really the three most common categories of physical remains that archaeologists deal with. And I just want to this is basically a list of some of the kinds of sites that we as archaeologists deal with. They really run the gambit in terms of places where humans have lived, been active in the past, and also, again, can be as recent as the recent past or can be quite ancient. And so let's wrap up this section by talking a little bit about some of the more common archaeological methods that archaeologists use. And so the first here is what we call archaeological survey. And so this is basically the systematic examination of the land for the purpose of discovering previously unrecorded archaeological sites. So this can take place if you're in a place like an agricultural field where you have high ground visibility. You can see the ground surface well. You can see artifacts lying on the ground surface. That might, archaeological survey in that context might involve simply inspecting the ground surface as you walk across it for artifacts. But if you're in an environment like the field school students here are in this picture, where there's pasture or it's wooded and so you have very low ground visibility, we tend to employ what's called shovel testing, which basically means in some sort of systematic way, usually on something like a 30-meter grid or a 10-meter grid, you excavate these regularly spaced shovel tests, and then you take the soil from these shovel tests and screen it through wire mesh, and when you identify artifacts, you have basically identified an archaeological site. So this is a very common method of archaeological survey shovel testing. Another method is excavation. This is probably what most people think about when they think about archaeologists and the manner in which we recover artifacts. So excavation just basically implies the large-scale excavation of soils to recover artifacts, ecofacts, and features. So you could say shovel testing is a kind of excavation. But generally when archaeologists talk about excavation, we're talking about a larger scale excavation that is represented by some small shovel test. So this photograph here shows an area that's been excavated by archaeologists. This is called a block excavation, where a large area has been exposed, and you can see they've uncovered a number of features here. It looks like a hearth and some pits. And then the last method I want to talk about, another one people probably aren't as familiar with and maybe don't associate with archaeology, with maybe the exception of ground penetrating radar. It's what we call remote sensing or geophysics. And so these are basically a collection of high-tech, non-destructive methods for acquiring data pertaining to the physical or chemical properties of an archaeological site. And in general, in most cases, the goal of this sort of survey is to identify subsurface features. So cultural features that are present in some location, but for whatever reason, you can't see them on the ground surface. And so I have a couple slides here with some examples of some geophysical data. And so this gray area, which is overlaid on an aerial photograph here, is basically showing the results of a magnetic radiometer survey out in this agricultural field. And this is at a site in Ohio called the Junction Group's Earthwork site. And so if you know much about archaeology, you probably recognize this as a Hopewell culture site, and a mound site related to the Hopewell culture. And so if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Junction Group Earthwork site, they will talk to you or tell you about how this site has been completely destroyed by cultivation over the years. And if you walked out into this field, it would just look like a regular field to you. You wouldn't really see mounds. They have been plowed down to the point that they are really no longer pronounced topographic features. But as you can see from Jared Burke's data here, they're still very much there. There are subsurface deposits of these mounds that are still very much there. And so remote sensing can tell us very important things about these kinds of sites, where from just looking at the sites, you might think these mounds have long since disappeared, but in many ways, they're still very much there. Identifying human burials is another very important thing that these methods, these geophysical methods, are used for. You can see on the left side of the image there, these sort of 4 units of data that have been collected. And you see the black dots there, or sort of black semicircular areas. These are basically the locations of human graves that have been detected by this instrument. And so this can be very important when you're talking about graves that are no longer marked with headstones of any kind. And so these methods provide you a non-destructive way of identifying these graves are here. Otherwise, about the only method to us is to use heavy machinery to strip away the topsoil in hopes of seeing the burial pits before we actually encounter human remains and destroy the remains with the heavy machinery. So that's certainly not a preferred method, and often geophysics can help us avoid that destructive uncovering of these kinds of human burials. So now that we've talked some about what archaeology is, let's get to the sort of ultimate point of this presentation, which is to talk about how archaeology and CLG programs can work together and what archaeology can contribute to CLG programs. So basically, in a word or in 2 words, archaeological survey, I think, is really the answer to that question, or it's certainly a very good place to start in answering that question. So what can archaeological survey do for you as a CLG? First and foremost, survey basically provides you an inventory of below-ground resources. The above-ground resources that we associate with the historic environment, quite easy to see. Architectural survey to record them, also a very important thing, but what often gets overlooked are the archaeological deposits that are associated with many of those historic structures that get accounted for in architectural surveys, or even in areas where there are no historic structures, but that are part of some community that's interested in historic preservation. By joining an archaeological survey with your architectural surveys, you're basically providing data for better and more comprehensive preservation planning. More comprehensive in the sense that now you are accounting for not only the above-ground resources, but the below-ground resources. And so even more than just having that inventory and having that awareness that these below-ground resources are present in your community, having this kind of data, having archaeological data, can really strengthen your ability when it comes to making an argument for some property's eligibility to the National Register. So if you have a historic building that you're trying to make this argument for, if you also have archaeological deposits associated with that building that can tell you even more about those people who lived at that building and what they did there, that really increases the significance of that site in terms of these criteria for National Register eligibility, and therefore can really strengthen your nomination. After you've done your archaeological survey and you've investigated the regions of your community, basically you then have research results in hand that can be used for educational and interpretive purposes. So this can be public and interpretive signs in public spaces, interpretive signs along trails, as we're shown here. I threw this image in the right end just because this is one of my favorite things to talk about as an archaeologist. What this image is showing is what's called the Columbian Exchange, which is basically, once you get into the period of European settlement in North America or in the Americas, you start getting this movement of New World plants to the Old World, and this movement of Old World plants and animals as well, of course, from the Old World to the New World. You also, of course, as they show here, you get European diseases coming to the Old World as well. There's another very important omission in this particular graph, which is human beings. Of course, the slave trade also brought human beings from the Old World to the New World. But there's just endless interpretive educational opportunities when you talk about what archaeology has taught us about the history of our use of these different kinds of plants, especially during the historic period when you start getting this exchange between continents. And you think of, Missouri is very much an agricultural state, and so there's really endless opportunities just with the history of corn. Corn has been domesticated on this continent for 9,000 to 10,000 years. So there's a very long and very interesting history there. And of course, corn has played a very important role in our recent agricultural past in the Midwest. And so there's just endless opportunities for interpreting this knowledge of the past to a population like the citizens of Missouri. Gardens, gardens within museums or outside of museums, or gardens within botanical areas that emphasize the growing of New World crops or emphasize the Old World crops that came to North America. You'll often see gardens, the Three Sisters gardens, that talk about how Native Americans used corn, squash, and beans and how they interplanted these species. And so there's just so many opportunities to take what archaeologists have taught us about the human use of plants in the past and incorporate that into educational and interpretive programs within communities. And then lastly, the last point I wanted to make about basically what archaeology or archaeological survey can do for you is that it's really an excellent vehicle for public engagement. The built environment out there that we all appreciate and that we work to preserve, it's sort of a passive thing in terms of the way that citizens interact with those resources as historic resources. And sometimes you may stop noticing that these are historic buildings because they're just part of your environment that you see every day. So you sort of lose that connection of the history of these places, even though that's the reason that they've been preserved. And so archaeology, through public archaeological programs, such as the one shown on the left here, whether it's a demonstration dig in a museum like these kids are taking part in, or whether it's an actual dig, whether you can certainly incorporate the public in these archaeological survey projects in your community where kids, adults go out, work under the supervision of archaeologists, get to see these artifacts that are being uncovered, get to talk to archaeologists about what these mean, what they tell us about the past. This is really, I've seen this over and over again, and have done a lot of these programs myself, and so it's a very rewarding experience and a very engaging experience especially for young people, to be involved in archaeology in this way and to really have this sort of hands-on experience and seeing these remains of the past and coming to understand what they can tell us about our past. And then the last photo there's demonstrations that you can do, flint knapping demonstrations. There's so many ways to engage the public with the archaeological record. So I would encourage all of you who are working in relation to CLG programs, or thinking about local historic preservation programs, to really think about how you could possibly incorporate archaeology into those efforts. And so you might be asking, you might be saying that, well, this all sounds good, Jeffrey, but where do I start? Well, the best place to start is to simply visit our website, or just simply Google Missouri Archaeological Consultants. We do maintain a list of archaeological consultants on our website. This is a pretty diverse group of people, archaeologists working at our state universities, at universities from other states, but also a lot of archaeologists working in the private sector. And I suspect if you approached any of these individuals about assisting you with a public archaeology program that featured archaeological survey, I'm certain you could find some takers and you could find some people interested in that who could help you write proposals to apply for grant money to support this kind of program. And certainly, I'm here. If you ever want some advice or some guidance on how to start a program like this, how you might work with archaeologies in your own respective programs, I'm always happy to have that conversation with anybody who would like that sort of guidance. So don't be shy about reaching out to me. So I will wrap up where we concluded with Indiana, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer those.